Alright guys, BLM here, and we're back with a new video. Now this is going to be a review of Shenmue I and II for the PS4. Now Shenmue is a series I've always wanted to get into, and for years I've heard about how great the series is, and how long fans have been waiting for the third game. To the point that when it was announced at E3 2015 that Shenmue III was coming out, even I was freaking out. And with Shenmue III finally coming out at the end of this year, I decided to give Shenmue I and II a shot, which thankfully was made easier by the PS4 collection coming out at the end of last year. And I gotta say, I really love this franchise. Now the games aren't perfect, they're far from perfect, but there's just some charm to them that I really enjoy. Now I'm going to be going over both games, but we're going to get started here with Shenmue I. Now Shenmue I is talked about as one of the best games ever made, and while it's not perfect, I feel like I finally understand why. The game is easily one of the most ambitious games ever made. It came out at the end of 1999 in Japan, being the most expensive game ever made at that point. Now Shenmue is a 3D open world game, and that wasn't super common back in 1999, especially one that tries to portray a realistic city filled with things to do. Now this is a game where you can interact with shops, NPCs, there's a day and night system, there's an in-game clock. In many ways this feels like a life simulator, where during most days you can just do whatever you want. There's also a currency system in the game. You could spend money on collectible capsule toys, you can buy items at the convenience shop, or you can play games at the arcade. This includes darts and the full arcade versions of Hang On and Space Harrier. Game does use QuickTime events, which is obviously a more prominent feature now, and the QuickTime events are, to be honest, pretty tough at points. There's some pretty long strings of QuickTime events, and you have to hit almost all of them. Towards the end of the game, you eventually get a job at the harbor, and this brings a new style of gameplay with it, where at the beginning of every day, you do races against your fellow employees with forklifts. And then you spend the rest of your day using the forklifts to transfer crates from warehouse to warehouse. And this is cool at first, however, after doing this for multiple days, it does get very repetitive. The combat in the game is similar to that of a mediocre beat-em-up / fighting game. It's a lot of button mashing earlier on, but the game does have some RPG elements in the sense that you can train and learn new moves that'll help you in future fights. And by the end of the game, you're going to need to know when to dodge, when to attack, what attack to use, that sort of thing. A problem I do have with this combat system, though, is the fact that your enemies don't have a health bar. And especially during boss battles, this becomes very frustrating because you don't know if you're making any progress or not. You could be wailing on a guy for like 20 hits and not even realize that he blocked every single one of them. Now, this game being from 1999, there's a lot of quality of life issues with this game. The biggest factor here is the fact that certain main objectives can only be accomplished during specific times in the day. And the big problem here is that there's no time skipping mechanic. There's no meditation mechanic like from The Witcher or anything. There's nothing like that. And within the game, it takes about 10 minutes or so for an hour to pass by, which means if it's at the beginning of the day and you have to wait until like the afternoon before you can do anything, that could lead up to half an hour of waiting. There's also a lot of backtracking in this game. You go through the same areas over and over and over again. Mind you, obviously you're doing different things within those areas, but it still gets pretty annoying. Though surprisingly, there is fast travel at some points in the game, but usually it only happens when you're leaving your house. The controls are pretty clunky in this game as well, where Ryo pretty much controls like a tank. There is a run button that allows him to run straight forward. However, if you're going to try to turn, it's really a pain. And you get stuck constantly. Whenever you're in a building, you always get stuck on little things, and it's really annoying. Now for the story. The story of Shenmue is just as ambitious as its gameplay. Where Yu Suzuki has planned out the story, he says that it's going to be 11 chapters and spread throughout 4 to 5 games, with this first game only covering Chapter 1. This series follows an 18-year-old martial artist named Ryo Hazuki as he goes on a quest for revenge after the murder of his father. You spend most of your time in this game running around town, talking to NPCs, finding out clues about Landy, the guy who killed your father. Thankfully, this game has a journal where it tells you your current objective, which proves to be a pretty big help considering some of the dialogue isn't super clear all the time. Speaking of dialogue, for the English language version, it's terrible. It's so bad. It's some of the worst localization I've ever seen. A lot of this comes from a lot of problems with the localization team, where multiple people had to be tasked with translating different parts of the script, and really the team was just completely overwhelmed with the massive amount of content. Now, the voice acting for this game is equally as bad, if not even worse. It's some of the worst voice acting I've ever heard. Then again, this was 1999, it was a different time, but it's still so bad, but so enjoyable. I had so much fun just like listening to these random conversations and these really dumb comments these people would be making. There's another similar problem here with the voice acting where all the voice acting had to be done in Japan. And because of that, they had a really restricted casting pool. Pacing of the story is probably my biggest problem with it. I mean, it's pretty slow paced at the beginning, but it's not terrible. Again, you're being introduced to a lot of things, so it's fine. But it really drags in the back third. A lot of that due to just you doing the same thing every single day. But I did come out of this game really enjoying the narrative and did think it was a good setup for future games. The soundtrack in this game is incredible, with the theme song being one of my favorite pieces of music in any game. Now, something I should mention considering I'm talking about the PS4 collection that came out is that these are HD ports. These are not remasters. Supposedly there was a remaster in development, however it was canceled and they decided to do a port instead. Due to the way the original game was coded, they weren't able to redo the cutscenes, so all of the cutscenes are in their original aspect ratio while the actual gameplay is in widescreen. They also took out some product placement, but outside of that, these are perfect ports of the Dreamcast version of the games. Overall, Shenmue is a really innovative and ambitious game, but one plagued with issues. From clunky gameplay to crappy voice acting and dialogue, but it does have an interesting story and some really fun gameplay elements for the time, which I still think make it worth the price of admission. And though I respect the hell out of this game, I don't think I can give it a score higher than a 7.5 out of 10. Alright, now let's move on to Shenmue II, which was released less than 2 years later, but thankfully it was made for a much lower price than the first game, a lot of that being due to a lot of the assets being made during the development of Shenmue I. And to me, Shenmue II is a bigger and better version of Shenmue 1 in every single way. The gameplay is more of the same, but with some very needed improvements. The NPCs are more varied, and now you can ask them to take you where you want to go, and all you will have to do is follow them, making it a lot easier to complete story objectives. The environments are much larger and much more colorful than the previous game, which was pretty gray. There are maps that you can buy for every single region that add a mini-map to the game, which is extremely helpful for the first 2/3 of the game. And these environments are just filled with more things to do. Now, money is much harder to come by in this game. In the original game, you did have a daily allowance. However, in this game, you have to earn all the money yourselves. Thankfully, with every NPC, you can ask them about ways to make money. You can ask them to take you to a gambling place where you play pachinko or you do some arm wrestling. They can tell you where to find a part-time job. They can lead you to a pawn shop where you can sell off items that you own. Now, there are even more quick time events in this game, which I did find pretty annoying, and if it wasn't for the manual save system, I would have lost my mind at points where there's a specific point in the game where you're trying to climb a building, which includes numerous quick time event sections, and if you fail just one, you have to start all the way from the beginning. The combat is more of the same. However, thankfully, they added health bars to the enemies. Now, this game has much more of a focus on the martial arts part of the game, which leads to more combat. But as I said, it's more refined. To be honest, it's much easier in this game. Thankfully, in this game, they added a time-skipping mechanic. So if you reach the location of a story mission before the time that you can activate it, it allows you to skip to the appropriate time. Now, there is still backtracking, and the controls are still pretty clunky, but they do fix most of the problems I had with the first game. Another interesting thing is that your save data from Shenmue 1 actually transfers over to Shenmue 2, giving you a lot of the money and the martial arts moves that you had from the previous game. Now, the story of Shenmue 2 is fantastic. It makes me really excited for Shenmue 3. Where Shenmue 1 only covered one chapter of Suzuki's plan, Shenmue 2 covers 3, leading to this game being much bigger in scale than the previous game, which was already a massive game in its own right. Now, Ryo's story here continues right where we left off from Shenmue 1, and throughout the game we go to 3 different cities, one for each act. Now, you could just tell the massive scale of this entire franchise, where in this game, very few answers that you wanted from the first game are answered. However, even more questions come up that I'm hoping will be answered in Shenmue 3. The dialogue and voice acting are still pretty bad, but it's still pretty fun. The pacing of the story is much better than the last game, but still has massive issues. The first third of the game is the best Shenmue has ever been, with interesting story stuff happening, and you being able to explore this massive new area. Now, the middle third is more of a mixed bag for me, not due to pacing, but more so because the actual city it takes place in, which is more gray and boring. Another issue that I have with it is that there's a lot of annoying gameplay elements in that section of the game where there's a really long tailing mission. There's a lot of street fighting, and at the end of the section, there's a massive dungeon-esque section where you have to climb 17 floors of a tower. And the last third is where the pacing is at its worst. You literally spend over an hour walking down a path. Obviously, there's some other stuff going on during this time. There's some cutscenes, there's some conversations, there's some quick time events, but it's still really boring. But overall, Shenmue II is a much more refined version of Shenmue 1, with better gameplay and an even more ambitious story. But it's not perfect. However, at the end of the day, I do still really love this game, and I'm going to give it an 8.5 out of 10. Now, I would definitely recommend getting this collection if you're willing to give Shenmue a shot. If you're into narrative-based games and willing to give a pass to terrible dialogue and voice acting, I think this is a must-play. Especially because you can get this collection for less than 20 bucks. And also, this will prepare you for Shenmue 3, which I'm really excited for, because one of the things I always thought when playing Shenmue 1 and 2 is just imagine if this was a modern game with modern gameplay mechanics and how great it would be. Now, that is it for my review of Shenmue 1 and Shenmue 2. Thank you for watching.